There's a thing every rancher learns and nobody teaches you. A donkey doesn't argue with you because it's dumb. It argues with you because it knows something you don't, and it has already decided your opinion doesn't matter. I spent 31 years telling myself that was just an old man's story. 31 years, until a gray jack named Biscuit planted his 4 feet in the middle of a dry wash and refused to take one more step, not for the rope, not for the whip I'm ashamed I reached for, not for the carrot, not for the cussing. He just stood there with his ears swiveled back like two radar dishes and his whole body gone stiff as a fence post, staring at a patch of nothing. I called him every name I had. I nearly left him. If I had, 3 people would be dead, and I'd have gone to my grave never knowing I was the fool who walked past it. This is the story of the day a stubborn donkey refused to move, and what his hooves did in the 90 seconds after. Stay with me to the end of part 2. There's a moment near the finish I still can't talk about without my throat closing up, and I've had 11 years to practice. The first thing you should know is that I didn't want the donkey. I want that on the record because everything that comes after only makes sense if you understand. I bought Biscuit out of spite. My neighbor Del Prather had been running his mouth at the feed store about how a mule or a jack was a coward's animal, a horse for men afraid of horses. And I'd had 2 beers and a bad week, and there was a gray jackstock donkey standing in a pen out back that nobody wanted because he'd bitten the auctioneer's son. So I bought him. $200 I didn't have, to prove a point to a man who never thought about me again after that afternoon. That's the kind of decision that shapes a life, the dumb, small, prideful ones. My name's Wade Coley. I ran 140 head of cattle on leased grazing land out past the Chiricahuas, high desert country where the sky is so big it makes you feel like a tick on the back of something enormous. My wife had been gone 4 years by then. Cancer. I'm not going to say more about that because this isn't that story, and because I don't do it well, the talking about her. I'll just tell you that after Ruth died, the ranch got very quiet, and I got quiet with it. And Biscuit, loud, opinionated, absolutely certain about everything, was maybe the only voice on that whole spread that ever talked back to me. He hated everyone the first month, bit me twice, kicked a hole in the tack room door, screamed his lungs out at 4 in the morning at coyotes that weren't there. I kept meaning to sell him. I kept not doing it. Somewhere around the 2nd month I started talking to him. Just chores talk at first. Move over, you gray idiot, that sort of thing. Then more. I told him things I hadn't told a living soul. I told him about Ruth. I told him I was afraid I was becoming the kind of old man who dies and nobody notices for a week. Biscuit would listen with those enormous ears cupped forward, and then he'd let out one long, wet, disgusted bray directly in my face, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. No sympathy, no advice, just a big animal telling me to get on with it. I'm giving you all this so you'll understand why. On the morning everything changed. I trusted him even when every human instinct I had was screaming that he was just being a stubborn ass. It was the 3rd week of July. Monsoon season in that country is a strange, violent, beautiful thing. The mornings come up clear and hammered blue, and by 2 in the afternoon the sky can turn the color of a bruise and drop an inch of rain in 20 minutes on ground so hard it can't drink. That water has to go somewhere. It goes into the washes. The dry arroyos that snake down out of the high country, bone dry 360 days a year, can turn into a wall of brown water moving faster than a horse can run. And it can do it under a blue sky right over your head because the storm that fed it is 10 miles up country where you can't even see it. Every kid raised in that country learns it. You do not camp in a wash. You do not cross a running wash. And you keep one eye up country always in July. I knew all that. I'd known it my whole life. It did not save me. Habit is a poor substitute for attention, and that morning my attention was worn thin as an old sock. We'd lost cattle up in a box canyon. 6 head drifted through a gap in the fence I'd been meaning to fix for a month. Another one of those small things. And I'd taken Biscuit up to help push them back down. I use him as a pack animal and a companion more than anything. He's too small and too opinionated to work cattle proper, but he'll carry my water and my fence tools, and he keeps the mood up. That morning I'd loaded him with a coil of wire, a come-along, my rifle, 2 gallons of water and my lunch, and we'd gone up before dawn to beat the heat. The clear part of the day is the part I remember in the sharpest detail, which is strange because nothing happened. We found the cattle, we patched the fence. I ate a bologna sandwich sitting on a rock while Biscuit worked over a stand of dry grass and swished flies, and I remember thinking in an idle, contented way that I was, in that exact moment, all right. Not happy. I wouldn't have gone that far, but all right. The sun was warm, the work was done. My animal was near me. Ruth had been dead 4 years, and the wound had finally scarred over enough that I could sit in the sun and taste bologna, and not feel like I was faking being a person. I want you to hold on to that feeling of all right, because I'd only get to keep it about another hour. We started down around 11. There's 2 ways off that mesa. The long way follows the ridgeline down through the pinon and takes the better part of 3 hours, easy going but slow. The short way drops straight down into Aravna Wash, a wide sandy arroyo, and follows the wash bed down to where it opens out a 1/4 mile from my truck and trailer. 45 minutes, tops, flat, easy footing in the sand. I'd taken it 100 times. I looked up country before I dropped in. I want that on the record too, because I've replayed it 10,000 times. I looked. The sky over the high peaks was clear. A few cotton puff clouds building, the way they do, but nothing dark, nothing that said danger. I made the call any reasonable man would have made. We took the short way. The wash was exactly as it always is, a wide ribbon of pale sand between 6-foot cutbanks, cottonwoods leaning in from the sides, the sand soft enough that our footsteps made no sound at all. The quiet down there is total. The banks cut off the wind. All you hear is your own breath and the creak of leather, and that day, the little dry chuff sound of Biscuit's hooves in the sand behind me. We'd gone maybe half a mile when he stopped. I felt it before I understood it. The lead rope came tight in my hand, and I turned, and there he was, all 4 feet planted, head up, ears hard back, every muscle in his gray body locked. He was staring down wash, the direction we were headed, at a bend maybe 200 yards ahead where the arroyo curved out of sight behind a shoulder of cutbank. "Come on," I said. "Biscuit, walk on." He didn't move. He didn't even flick an ear at me, which was unusual because Biscuit always had something to say. This was a different kind of stillness. This was concentration. I pulled the rope. Nothing. You cannot outpull a donkey. Anyone who's tried can tell you it's like trying to drag a parked truck. I clucked, I coaxed. I dug a piece of my sandwich crust out of my shirt pocket and held it under his nose. He wouldn't take it. A donkey who won't take food is an animal in a state I didn't have a name for yet. "What is wrong with you?" I said. And here is where I'm not proud. The heat was coming up. I was tired. I had a truck to load and a 2-hour drive and 140 head of cattle that don't care about your feelings, and I had a stubborn animal costing me time for no reason a human eye could see. I got angry. I got the rope up over my shoulder and I leaned into it with my whole weight. Boots dug into the sand and I hauled, and I said some things I won't repeat, and Biscuit answered the only way he could. He sat right down on his haunches like a dog, 400 pounds of gray refusal, and I fell over backward in the sand with the rope burning through my hands. I lay there in the wash and looked up at the strip of blue sky between the cutbanks, and I laughed, actually, because there was nothing else to do. Then I got up, and I did the thing I'm most ashamed of in this whole account. I reached back and pulled a dry cottonwood switch off the sand and I raised it. I didn't hit him, I want to be clear. I raised it and Biscuit turned his head and looked at me. I've spent 11 years trying to describe that look and I still can't do it right. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance, even though God knows he had plenty of that. It was, and I know how this sounds, it was pleading. It was an animal looking at a man it had decided, against all its own instincts to trust and begging him to trust back. His eyes were rimmed white, and his nostrils were huge and working, and he made a sound I'd never heard him make, a low sort of moan down in his chest, and he swung his head back around to stare at that bend in the wash. I dropped the switch. I don't know why. I've never known why. I'd like to tell you it was wisdom, some deep old rancher's knowing. It wasn't. I think I was just too tired to be cruel, and the tiredness left a gap, and into that gap came the first cold thread of a feeling I couldn't name, the feeling that Biscuit was not being stubborn. That Biscuit was afraid, and that a donkey doesn't get afraid of a bend in an empty wash for no reason. "Okay," I said, my voice came out different. "Okay, what do you hear?" And I went quiet and I listened. At first, nothing. The total wash-bottom silence. My own heart. A cicada somewhere up on the bank winding up and winding down. I remember thinking I was a fool, standing in a hot arroyo taking orders from a donkey, and I remember starting to feel embarrassed even though there was no one to see me. Then I heard it. It's a sound you feel before you hear it, if that makes sense. It came up through the soles of my boots, through the sand, before it ever reached my ears. A deep, low, continuous rumble felt more than heard, like a freight train 2 counties over, like a sound the ground itself was making. It was coming from up country, from behind us, from the direction of the high peaks where the sky had been clear as glass 45 minutes before. And I understood everything all at once, in a single freezing rush. Somewhere up in that high country, over ground I couldn't see, a storm had opened up. Not over me. Over the peaks, 10 miles up, under clouds that had built and burst in the time it took me to eat a sandwich and patch a fence and walk half a mile down a pretty sandy wash. And every drop of it was funneling down, off the bare rock, into the drainages, into the arroyos, into this arroyo, gathering and joining and building into a single moving wall of water and mud and cottonwood trunks and dead cattle and drowned rattlesnakes. And it was coming down Aravna Wash toward the bend, toward us, and it was close. The rumble was getting louder. I could feel it climbing in my chest. Biscuit hadn't been staring at the bend ahead because the danger was ahead. He'd been staring at the bend because that's where the wash straightened out. That's the direction the sound was funneling from, bending around the cutbank and reaching him. Some frequency in it his ears could catch and mine couldn't, minutes before the water itself would come around that same corner. He'd heard the flood coming while it was still miles away. And I had raised a stick to him for it. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember I was already moving. The cutbanks in that stretch were 6, 7 feet of vertical crumbling dirt, a wall no way up. But 30 yards back, the way we'd come, there was a place where an old cattle trail cut down into the wash at an angle, a ramp of sorts, the only break in the banks for a quarter mile in either direction. 30 yards, uphill through soft sand. With a loaded donkey, and a rumble now loud enough that I could hear the individual crashes in it, the sound of things being destroyed. I didn't have to pull Biscuit anymore. The second I turned back up wash, he was ahead of me. That contrary, immovable animal that would not walk one step forward was now dragging me, the rope tight, his hooves throwing sand. All his fear turned into a single straight line up that wash toward the cattle trail ramp. I ran behind him with my hand locked on the lead and my lungs burning and the come-along and the wire and my rifle all banging off his pack and my own body. And behind us, I did not look, but I heard it. Behind us the rumble turned into a roar and the light in the wash changed, went dim, as if a cloud had crossed the sun, except it wasn't a cloud. We hit the ramp. Biscuit went up it like the devil was on his tail, and I went up behind him on my hands and boots, clawing, and we came up over the lip of the cutbank onto the flat, into the open desert, into the sun and the creosote and the blessed high ground. And I turned around, just in time to see it come around the bend. I'll tell you about that in part 2. I have to. But I want to stop here on the top of that bank, with my heart going like a hammer and my hands full of sand and Biscuit beside me heaving for breath. his gray side slick, that ridiculous coil of wire hanging off his pack, because in that exact second, before the water even reached us, before I understood how close it had been, I did a thing I'd never done in the whole time I'd owned him. I put both my arms around his neck. I put my face in his mane in the hot, dusty animal smell of him, and I held on, and I said thank you into his hide, over and over, thank you, thank you, thank you. He stood there and let me. That contrary, biting, screaming, immovable animal stood absolutely still and let a broken old man hang on his neck and shake. Then the flood came around the bend, and I looked up, and I saw what we'd been standing in the middle of 90 seconds before. The water came around the bend brown and alive. I've tried to describe it to people and I always fail, because your mind wants to make it be like water, a river, a flood, something with a surface and a flow. It wasn't like that. It was a moving wall of the earth itself, 6 feet high at the leading edge, the color of wet clay, and it was carrying the whole world in it. Whole cottonwood trees rode it, root balls and all, turning slowly like they weighed nothing. A fence post. A blue plastic barrel from God knows whose ranch upstream. A dead calf, and I looked away from that fast. It hit the bend where we'd been standing and it didn't turn cleanly. It climbed the outside cut bank, the far one, threw a sheet of mud 15 feet up the bank, and tore a cottonwood I'd walked under 2 minutes before clean out of the ground and swallowed it. The spot where Biscuit had planted his feet and refused to move was, by then, under 8 feet of moving water. I stood on the bank with my arm still over his neck, and I did the math a man does at a time like that, the involuntary, sickening math. If he'd walked on when I told him, if I'd hit him with that switch and he'd flinched forward like a beaten animal does, if I'd gotten him moving even 10 seconds sooner toward that bend instead of stopping, we'd have been around it, in the narrow, straight stretch beyond, with no ramp, no break in the banks when the wall came through. They wouldn't have found us. That country doesn't give bodies back. The wash runs to the flats and spreads out, and the desert takes what it takes. I sat down. I just sat right down in the creosote and shook. Biscuit lowered his big head and lipped at my hair, which he'd never once done, and I let him. That would be a fine place to end it. Man saved by loyal animal learns to trust, weeps in the desert. If this were a made-up story, that's where I'd stop. But it isn't made up and it isn't finished, because the flood wasn't done, and neither was that day, and the part I still can't talk about without my throat closing hadn't happened yet. I'd been sitting maybe 2 minutes getting my legs back when I heard it. Under the roar of the water, and a flood like that roars, it's a physical pressure on your ears under it, I heard a human voice. I want you to understand how faint it was. It was nothing. It was less than nothing, a thread, and I told myself it was a bird or a trick of the water or my own rattled brain. But Biscuit's head came up again, ears forward, locked on the downwash direction, the way he'd locked on the bend, and every hair on my arm stood up, because I'd learned my lesson about that donkey's ears about 90 seconds too recently to ignore them. I got up and I ran along the top of the cut bank, downwash, following the flood, and Biscuit came with me. I hadn't even kept hold of the rope. He just came, and about 150 yards down, where the wash widened and the banks dropped lower, I saw them. 3 of them, a man, a woman, and a boy of maybe 10. They were up a cottonwood, one of the big living ones, still rooted, that stood in a bend where the water piled up against it, clinging in the branches maybe 8 feet above the flood, and the flood was chewing at the base of that tree, and I could see the whole tree shudder each time a log struck it. Their truck was in the water below them on its side, half swallowed, and I understood in a sick flash what had happened. They tried to cross the wash down at the low ford, the way people do, the way the signs beg you not to, and the wall had caught them, and they'd gotten out and up the nearest tree, and now they were treed above a flood that was going to take the tree. The man saw me. He started screaming and waving one arm, keeping the other locked around the boy. The wind and the roar ate most of it, but I got the shape of it. Help, and my son, and please. I had a rope. That's the thing, I had a rope, the lead rope, and I had a come-along and a coil of fence wire, all of it still on Biscuit's pack, all of it that I'd cursed as dead weight 45 minutes earlier. But 150 feet of tumbling floodwater is not a thing you throw a lead rope across. The tree was too far out and the water between us was death, plain death, moving fast enough to break a man's legs and hold him under. I stood on the bank with my rope in my hands, and I have never felt so useless in my life. I could see them. I could see the boy's face. And I could not reach them, and the tree was going to go. Then Biscuit walked down the bank. Not into the water. He wasn't suicidal, and neither was I. He walked down the sloping bank to a point where a big cottonwood on my side, the near bank, leaned way out over the flood, its trunk nearly horizontal for the first 10 feet before it curved up. And he stopped under it and he looked at me, and then he looked up at the leaning trunk, and then he looked at me again, and I swear before God I understood him as clear as if he'd used words. The two trees, the one they were in and the leaning one on my side, their branches at the top were close, not touching, but close, maybe 15 feet apart at the highest, thinnest branches where the flood couldn't reach. I'm not a young man, and I'm not a brave one, and I want that in the record too. But I climbed that leaning cottonwood on my bank with the come-along and the wire and the rope, out along the horizontal trunk over the roaring water with my arms and legs wrapped around it like a possum, out to where it curved up into the branches, until I was as high and as far out as I dared, and the whole tree swayed under me, and the water was a brown blur 10 feet below, throwing spray in my face. And from up there, the gap to their tree was maybe that 15 feet, close enough maybe for a thrown weight. I tied my heavy come-along hook to the end of the lead rope and I threw it, missed, hauled it back hand over hand, throwing my shoulder out, doing it, threw again, missed. The man was screaming at me to hurry and I couldn't. My hands were shaking too bad, and I remember thinking with a terrible calm that I was going to watch this family die 15 feet away because I couldn't throw a rope, and that this was somehow worse than dying myself. Third throw, the man in the tree let go of the trunk with his free hand and lunged and caught it. Caught the hook. Nearly fell doing it, the whole family screamed, but he caught it, and he wrapped it around a solid branch and hauled the rope tight, and now there was a line between the two trees, my lead rope and then wire I'd tied on to lengthen it. A thin, sagging, ridiculous line over that murderous water. I got the boy across first. The father tied the rope around him under his arms, and I braced in the crook of the branches and hauled, and the mother pushed him off into the air, and for a few seconds that boy hung out over the full roaring width of the flood on a fenced store rope tied by a man who'd bought a donkey out of spite. And he came across hand over hand where he could, and me hauling where he couldn't, and I got a fist in his shirt and dragged him into the branches and held him, and he was crying and clawing at me and alive. Alive. I passed him down the trunk to the bank, to solid ground, to Biscuit, who, and this is true, I don't care how it sounds, put himself between that boy and the water and would not move, a wall, a gray wall, until the child was well back from the edge. The mother next, then the father last, the way a father does it, and by the time he came across the tree they'd been in was groaning and leaning and losing its grip on the earth, and he came fast, and when he was 6 feet from me the flood took his tree, just took it, rolled it under and away like it had never stood there. He was over the water when it went, hanging on my line, and if he'd waited 10 more seconds, but he didn't, and I got him, and we came down out of the leaning cottonwood onto the bank in a pile, all of us, and lay in the creosote heaving. The boy's name was Marcus. I only learned that later. The parents were Anna and Tom, driving home to Wilcox, took the wrong ford, made the one mistake that country doesn't forgive. Tom kept trying to give me money afterward, out on the road, and I kept not taking it, and finally he just held on to me and cried and I let him. The way I'd let Biscuit lip my hair, because sometimes the only thing to do with another person's need is to stand still and let them lean. Here's the part I can't get through. When it was over, when we were all on the high ground and the shaking had turned into that loose watery calm that comes after, the boy Marcus pulled away from his mother and walked over to Biscuit. And Biscuit, who bit auctioneers' sons and kicked holes in doors and screamed at 4 in the morning, lowered his enormous ugly gray head down to that child's level and stood there. And Marcus put both his arms around the donkey's neck, in the exact place I had, and pressed his face into his mane, and Biscuit closed his eyes. And I had to turn around and look at the water, because I couldn't watch it, because it was the thing Ruth used to say to me in the bad last months when I couldn't see any reason to keep any of it going. She used to say, "You never know what you're for, Wade, until the day you're for it." And I bought a worthless donkey out of spite, and kept a worthless donkey out of loneliness, and talked to a worthless donkey because I had no one else. And that worthless donkey had heard death coming 3 miles off and planted his feet and refused to let me walk into it. And because he refused, I was standing on that bank 15 minutes later at the one spot on 10 miles of wash where I could reach a drowning child. You never know what you're for until the day you're for it. I don't know if the donkey knew. I've thought about it 11 years and I don't know. People want me to say he sensed the family, sensed some grand purpose, and I won't say that because I don't believe it, and Biscuit would call me a liar if he could. I think he just heard a flood and got scared and wouldn't move, the way any good desert-smart animal would, and everything after that was just the accident of where we happened to be standing when he did it. I think it was luck. But I've come to believe that luck like that, luck that saves 4 lives, luck that puts a broken man exactly where he needs to be for something again. I've come to believe you don't get to call that nothing just because you can't explain it. You don't get to look a thing like that in the eye and call it a coincidence. Maybe it was. Maybe the whole world is coincidence all the way down. But I stood on that bank and I chose, right then, to call it something else, and I've never taken it back. Biscuit died 2 winters ago. Old age in his sleep, in a barn I built him warmer than my own house. I buried him myself, which about killed me, an old man with a backhoe crying in the January cold. Marcus came to it. He's 21 now, drove all the way from Tucson, stood at the grave with his hand on the frozen dirt for a long time and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. On the way out he stopped by me and he said one thing. He said, he didn't want to move, huh? And I said, no, he surely didn't. And that was all. That was the whole eulogy, from the only 2 people on earth who understood exactly what it meant. I keep his halter on a nail by my door. Every morning I say good morning to it, out loud like a fool, like a lonely old man, which is what I am. I don't expect that to change. But I get up. I keep getting up. Because a stubborn donkey taught me the one thing I most needed to know and could never have learned from any person, which is that the whole point of being alive is that you never do know what you're for. So you'd best stay standing, on whatever high ground you can find, in case the day comes around the bend when you're for something after all.